My name is Alara Quinn. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been described the same way. Steady, reasonable, soft-spoken. I work in risk management for a mid-sized financial institution, one of those quiet roles where you don't get applause for what you do. You just prevent disasters that no one ever sees. People tend to mistake calm for compliance. My in-laws certainly did. If you met me at a dinner party, you might assume I'm the kind of woman who smooths things over, the one who refills the wine glasses before anyone asks, the one who lets a comment slide because it's not worth it. I don't interrupt. I don't compete for volume. I don't demand attention. And that, I've learned, makes some people very comfortable underestimating me. This story begins with something that sounds almost theatrical. I went on my honeymoon, and while I was gone, my in-laws changed the locks on my house. Yes, my house. When I came back from 10 days in Santorini, sunburned, newly married, and still believing in fresh starts, I stood in front of my own front door and realized my key no longer worked. I thought it was a mistake, a jammed lock, a misunderstanding. It wasn't. They thought they had won something. They thought they had secured control. They thought silence meant surrender. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that long before that lock turned against me, I had already secured something far more permanent than a key. And when the bank called a few weeks later, everything shifted. This isn't a story about screaming matches or dramatic revenge. There were no shattered plates, no viral confrontations. There was no triumphant speech on a front lawn. There was paperwork. There was patience. There was a choice. I'm telling you this, not because I want sympathy, and not because I want you to hate anyone in this story. I'm telling it because sometimes the loudest victories are the quietest ones. Sometimes power isn't about who holds the door, it's about who holds the foundation beneath it. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been assigned a role you didn't choose, if you've ever stood outside something that was supposed to be yours, then you might understand why this story matters. Have you ever been mistaken for weaker than you really are? When I first met my husband's parents, I already understood the dynamic before anyone explained it. They were a family built on volume. Sunday dinners weren't conversations, they were competitions. Opinions overlapped, stories were interrupted, decisions were made mid-sentence by whoever spoke the loudest. My husband, Daniel, had learned early to keep the peace by agreeing quickly and retreating quietly. I didn't retreat, but I didn't compete either. I listened. To them, that looked like submission. His mother, Caroline, introduced me to extended relatives as Alara. She works with numbers. Not as a director, not as someone who managed portfolios worth hundreds of millions, just numbers, as if I filed receipts for a hobby. His father, Martin, would nod politely when I spoke about work, then redirect the conversation to real estate strategy, usually his own. He liked to talk about leverage and risk as if they were gambling tricks, not disciplines. I would smile and let him finish. Sometimes he'd say something technically incorrect. I never corrected him. Not because I couldn't, because I was observing. From the outside, I fit their ideal daughter-in-law profile perfectly. Educated, stable job, well-spoken, no dramatic past, no loud personality. I brought wine to dinner. I remembered birthdays. I offered to help in the kitchen. Caroline once said, laughing, "Daniel finally found someone sensible, not like those girls who need attention." I understood what that meant. It meant I was safe, predictable, manageable. They assumed I would orbit their sun, that I would adapt to their traditions, their opinions, their structure. They assumed that my calm was emptiness. The truth was more complicated. I grew up in a house where silence was survival. My father was charismatic but impulsive, business ventures that rose quickly and collapsed faster. My mother compensated by becoming meticulous. Contracts were read twice. Accounts were reconciled nightly. I learned early that stability isn't loud. It's constructed. So when I entered Daniel's family, I wasn't intimidated. I was studying architecture. I noticed how often finances were discussed casually, but rarely precisely. I noticed how often Daniel deferred to his father in matters involving property, investments, or big decisions. I noticed that when Caroline said, "Family is everything," what she meant was, family is hierarchy. Where did I fit in that hierarchy? Helpful, secondary, temporary. The house Daniel and I moved into after our engagement was technically ours, but the down payment conversation had been dominated by Martin's voice. He had helped guide the decision. He had advised on the mortgage structure. He said it proudly at dinner. Young people need direction. No one asked what I did for a living in detail. No one asked who reviewed the contract. No one asked whose credit profile secured the better rate. They saw Daniel's last name on the mailbox and assumed ownership followed blood. I let them. There's a specific kind of invisibility that doesn't hurt at first. It almost feels efficient. No one scrutinizes you when they believe you're harmless. No one questions your late nights with spreadsheets. No one wonders why you keep a slim black notebook in your bag at every family gathering. I would jot down comments sometimes, not because I planned retaliation, but because patterns interest me. Caroline dismissed my suggestion about refinancing timelines. Martin insists joint accounts are simpler if managed by the more experienced party. Daniel says, Dad understands this stuff better. I wasn't angry. I was taking inventory. In their narrative, I was the sensible wife, the supportive partner, the quiet addition to an established system. They never considered that I might understand that system better than they did. They never considered that I might be building something parallel to it. And most of all, they never imagined I would be the one holding the real risk assessment. That misunderstanding would eventually cost them. But at that time, I was simply the quiet daughter-in-law who smiled too easily and spoke too little. Invisible people see everything. The first moment of disrespect wasn't loud enough to echo. It happened 3 months before the wedding, over dessert at Caroline's dining table. Lemon tart, too sweet, powdered sugar still settling on the plates, when Martin leaned back in his chair and said, almost casually, well, once you're married, we'll finally have some structure around that house. I remember pausing with my fork halfway to my mouth. Structure? I asked lightly. He nodded, as if clarifying something obvious. Daniel's always been a bit relaxed, but now that it's official, we can make sure the property stays in the family long term. We'll need to revisit the title at some point. Revisit the title? It was said like a housekeeping task, like rearranging furniture. Daniel didn't react. He just sipped his wine. Caroline smiled at me across the table. It's just paperwork, dear, nothing complicated. Martin's very protective of family assets. Family assets? The house I had co-signed for, the house that my income had qualified for, the house whose mortgage terms I had negotiated line by line. I felt something small and sharp settle under my ribs. I could have corrected them right there. I could have calmly explained that the property was already structured deliberately, that the ownership split was intentional, that the lending institution didn't revisit titles for comfort. But I didn't. Instead, I asked, what kind of changes were you thinking about? Martin launched into a confident explanation about consolidating interests, simplifying estate planning, and ensuring the Quinn line was protected. The Quinn line? I noticed the word choice, not Daniel and Alara, not our future. The line. I smiled politely. That's interesting. Interesting? It was the safest phrase I knew. After dinner in the car, I asked Daniel about it. He shrugged. Dad just likes control. He won't actually do anything without us. US. But the conversation hadn't felt like us. It had felt like a plan being outlined in front of me, not with me. I told myself I was overanalyzing. Weddings make families territorial. Parents panic about change. It's normal, I reasoned. Harmless. Still, that night I opened my black leather notebook. I wrote, March 14th. Conversation about revisiting the title. Language. Structure. Protect line. Family assets. Daniel passive. No objection. I didn't write it in anger. I wrote it because something in me understood that language predicts behavior. Over the next few weeks, small comments continued. Caroline suggested it might be easier if Daniel handled the larger financial decisions after the wedding. Martin is offering to review our insurance policies. Jokes about how women don't enjoy dealing with banks. They said these things with smiles, with laughter, with plausible deniability. Each comment was small enough to ignore in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern. I was competent enough to contribute income, but not authority. The first small cut isn't meant to wound deeply. It's meant to test whether you bleed. I didn't. Outwardly, I remained composed. I continued attending dinners. I continued offering thoughtful input. Measured, neutral, never confrontational. Internally, I shifted 1 degree. I began reviewing every document connected to the house again. Not because anything was wrong, because clarity is power. I confirmed the title status, verified beneficiary designations, reread the mortgage covenants, quietly. No announcements, no accusations. If you ask me now, when I first understood that I might need to protect myself, it wasn't the honeymoon, it wasn't the lock. It was that lemon tart evening when someone casually discussed restructuring my home as if I were decorative. The cut was small, but it was intentional. And intention, once revealed, doesn't disappear. It waits. Disrespect doesn't arrive as a storm. It arrives as weather. At first, you comment on it, then you adjust to it. Eventually, you dress for it. After the revisit the title conversation, nothing dramatic happened. No documents appeared, no demands were made. Life continued as it always had. Wedding planning, vendor meetings, seating charts, cake tastings. And yet something subtle had shifted. Caroline began including herself in decisions that weren't hers to make. She would ask Daniel about our guest list and say things like, "We should keep it elegant. Alara seems practical, but weddings are about legacy." Practical. The word followed me everywhere. Practical shoes, practical career, practical temperament. Not visionary, not strategic. Practical. Martin, meanwhile, became increasingly interested in our finances. He'd asked Daniel what our monthly payment was, whether we'd considered restructuring under a family trust, and whether we'd protected the property properly. When Daniel would glance at me, as if inviting me to respond, Martin would interrupt gently. "I'm just looking out for you, son. These things..." Complicated. Complicated. I work in risk assessment. Complexity is my professional language, but I learned something during that period. Correcting someone who benefits from misunderstanding you rarely changes their opinion. It only escalates their defensiveness. So I stayed measured. At one dinner, Martin explained to a distant cousin that he had helped the kids secure the house. I was standing 3 feet away. I could have clarified that he had offered suggestions, yes, but that the actual approval hinged on my debt-to-income ratio and my credit score. Instead, I smiled and refilled a water glass. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table afterward. "He just likes feeling involved." I nodded, because I understood that Daniel wasn't dismissing me. He genuinely believed these were harmless ego performances. He believed that by letting his father narrate involvement, everyone stayed calm. And for a while, I told myself the same thing. It's easier to rationalize disrespect when it comes wrapped in affection. Caroline still hugged me tightly at the door. She still texted heart emojis. Martin still called me smart girl, in that patronizing but playful tone. Nothing overt, nothing explosive, just a quiet assumption that authority flowed in one direction. There was a moment, though, small, almost invisible, that I still remember clearly. We were reviewing final paperwork with our real estate attorney before the wedding, ensuring everything was updated post-marriage. Daniel mentioned casually that his father might want to look over the trust language. The attorney looked at me. Not at Daniel, at me. "Is that something you'd like?" she asked. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. I answered calmly, "No, the current structure is intentional." Daniel blinked, surprised by my firmness, but he didn't argue. That was the first time I felt the quiet divide forming, not between his parents and me, but between perception and reality. At family gatherings, I was still the sensible daughter-in-law. In legal rooms, I was the decision-maker. The normalization of disrespect works because it trains you to doubt your own threshold. You begin asking yourself, is this worth addressing? Am I being sensitive? Is harmony more important than accuracy? For a long time, I chose harmony. But harmony without respect is just controlled silence. And I was beginning to understand the difference. The thing about weather is this: you can tolerate it for a season. But if you ignore it long enough, you forget what clear skies feel like. I hadn't reached my breaking point yet, but I had stopped pretending it wasn't raining. It wasn't written down anywhere. No one handed me a script. But over time, the role became clear. I was the stabilizer, the agreeable one. The woman who would smooth Daniel's impulsiveness, soften family tension, and quietly reinforce the structure that already existed. Do not challenge it, not reshape it, just support it. Caroline began introducing me in the subtle, telling ways. "This is Alara. She keeps Daniel organized." Or, "She's very good at details." Details, not decisions. Martin, on the other hand, assigned me an even narrower function: administrative intelligence without authority. At a post-wedding brunch, while discussing long-term plans, he leaned toward Daniel and said, "When you two expand, we'll make sure the property's positioned correctly. I'll guide you through it." I was sitting directly beside my husband. No one looked at me. I wasn't excluded loudly. I was bypassed efficiently. That's how roles solidify, through repetition without resistance. Daniel didn't mean harm. He simply operated inside the hierarchy he had always known. His father handled big structure. His mother curated an emotional tone, and now I was expected to manage logistics and remain grateful. I noticed something else, too. The more I complied, the more comfortable they became with deciding on my behalf. Caroline once texted Daniel about repainting the guest room in something neutral before grandchildren someday. The room was in my house. My inbox remained untouched. Martin offered to connect us with a better insurance broker. I already had one. He never asked. It would have been easy to confront them, to insist on visibility, to demand acknowledgement. But confrontation often feeds the narrative you're trying to escape. If I had reacted emotionally, it would have confirmed what they subtly implied, that I was sensitive, overprotective, and territorial. So instead, I leaned into the role. I allowed them to believe I was simply the organized wife, the steady presence, the one who made things run smoothly but didn't steer. What they didn't realize was that organization is a form of control. I kept immaculate records of every property-related document. I ensured digital copies were stored independently. I maintained direct communication with our bank, our attorney, and our insurance provider. Not secretly, just quietly. When Caroline once joked, "You're so good at taking care of things," I smiled. "Yes," I said gently, "then I am." There is power in allowing someone to underestimate the scope of what you're taking care of. The assigned role wasn't accidental, it was strategic from their perspective. If I remained secondary, then decisions could be influenced without negotiation. If I remained agreeable, then their authority remained unchallenged. They didn't want conflict. They wanted continuity. And I looked like continuity. But here's what they misunderstood. I don't resist by arguing. I resist by building. By the time our honeymoon approached, the pattern felt almost settled. The hierarchy was assumed, the roles rehearsed, the dynamic stable. They believed they understood who I was. Helpful, supportive, predictable. They had no idea that I had already begun thinking several steps ahead. Not because I wanted war, but because I believe in contingency planning. In my profession, you never wait for a crisis to secure leverage. You prepare quietly before anyone realizes there's risk. And though I hadn't yet seen the lock on my own front door refuse me, I had already ensured that if anyone ever tried to redefine my place, they wouldn't control the outcome. They only controlled the narrative. And narratives are fragile things. The shift didn't happen when they changed the locks. It happened a week before the honeymoon. We were at Caroline and Martin's house for what was supposed to be a celebratory dinner. Daniel had just received a promotion, and there was champagne on the counter. The air felt light, predictable, safe. Halfway through the evening, Martin brought out a folder. It was thick, tabbed, organized. He placed it in front of Daniel like a gift. "I've been thinking about long-term protection," he said. "Especially now that you're married. This is just a draft framework for consolidating the house under a family trust. Cleaner, smarter." He spoke confidently, already assuming gratitude. Daniel looked impressed. "Wow, Dad. You didn't have to." I reached for the folder before he finished the sentence. No one stopped me. They didn't think they needed to. I flipped through it slowly. The language was polished. The structure is familiar. The trust would place the property under a broader family entity, with Martin as managing trustee for efficiency. I kept my expression neutral. Caroline smiled gently. "It's just to keep everything streamlined, dear. Families who don't plan ahead regret it later." Streamlined, efficient, protective. The vocabulary of control always disguises itself as care. I closed the folder carefully. "It's thorough," I said. Martin nodded, pleased. Then I asked one question. "What scenario are you mitigating?" He paused. "I'm sorry." "In risk terms," I clarified softly. "What specific exposure are we addressing with this structure?" The room went quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not tense, just recalibrating. Martin recovered quickly. "It's not about exposure, it's about legacy." "That's not the same thing," I replied, still calm. Daniel shifted beside me. I could feel him trying to keep the peace, but this time I didn't defer. I wasn't angry, I was awake. In that moment, I saw it clearly. This wasn't about guidance. It wasn't about advice. It was about ownership, of property, of narrative, of authority. And they believed they could maneuver it quietly, because I would avoid friction. I slid the folder back across the table. "I appreciate the effort," I said evenly, but the current structure already mitigates liability and ensures survivorship. I'm comfortable with it. Martin's smile thinned just slightly. You've reviewed every angle. Yes, it wasn't a challenge, it was a statement. For the first time since I'd entered that family, I didn't soften my certainty. Daniel looked between us, confused. Maybe we can just think about it, he offered. I placed my hand over his. We already have, I said gently. The shift wasn't explosive. There was no raised voice, no accusation. But something invisible cracked. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet. You seemed intense, he said carefully. I was precise, I corrected. He didn't argue. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat at our kitchen island with my black notebook open. I didn't write much, just one line. They are testing structural control, and beneath it, prepare accordingly. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition. For months, I had rationalized the small cuts, the bypassing, the narrative reshaping. But that folder was different. It wasn't commentary. It was action. And action requires response. Not confrontation. Response. The next morning, before leaving for work, I made 3 phone calls. Calm, professional, routine. No one noticed anything change. But internally, I had shifted from passive observation to active positioning. I still smiled at family dinners. I still attended brunches. I still thanked Caroline for the recipes. But something fundamental had recalibrated. Silence was no longer endurance. It was a choice. And I had just decided how I intended to use it. After that dinner, I didn't argue again. That's what surprised them the most. There were no follow-up confrontations, no cold shoulders, no defensive speeches about boundaries. I didn't bring up the trust proposal at future gatherings. I didn't warn Daniel that his parents were overstepping. I simply went quiet. But this time, the silence wasn't tolerance. It was designed. There's a difference between silence born of avoidance and silence born of strategy. One feels small, the other feels deliberate. I began declining certain financial conversations altogether. When Martin asked Daniel at Sunday lunch whether we had made progress on restructuring, I smiled and said, we're comfortable with our current framework. No elaboration, no debate. When Caroline pressed about future expansion plans, you'll need more space once there are children, I responded gently. We evaluate growth based on stability, not projection. They didn't fully understand what I meant. That was intentional. At home, Daniel noticed the shift before anyone else did. You don't engage anymore, he said one evening while we were cooking. I engage where it matters, I replied. He studied me carefully. You think they're trying to take control? I think they believe they already have it. That sentence lingered between us. For the first time, Daniel didn't immediately defend them. Silence unsettles people who are used to influence. When you stop reacting, they can't measure their effect on you. When you stop debating, they can't reposition the narrative. Martin tried once more. He invited Daniel to lunch, just the 2 of them. I found out later that he presented another version of the trust concept, this time simplified, more flexible. Daniel brought it home, hesitant. I didn't dismiss it. I asked to see it. I read it thoroughly, again. Then I handed it back. If you're comfortable transferring decision authority externally, that's your choice, I said calmly. But understand the implications before you sign anything. He frowned. You make it sound like surrender. I met his eyes. Because it would be. There was no anger in my voice, no accusation, just clarity. Daniel didn't sign. Over the next few weeks, something subtle happened. The more composed I remained, the more impatient Martin became. The more vague Caroline's reassurances sounded. Control requires response. When response disappears, control weakens. Meanwhile, I was doing something they never noticed. I was strengthening my position. I reviewed every clause in our mortgage agreement again. I ensured the servicing bank had direct contact protocols that required dual authorization for structural changes. I confirmed beneficiary alignment. I separated certain financial reserves into individually titled accounts, legally, transparently, responsibly. Nothing dramatic, nothing secret, just disciplined preparation. At family dinners, I became almost serene. I listened, I observed. I asked neutral questions. Martin eventually stopped bringing up frameworks. Caroline shifted to softer emotional angles, comments about unity, about keeping everything simple. They mistook my calm for concession. They believed the resistance had passed. They thought I had returned to my assigned role. But internally, I was mapping risk exposure as I would in any professional assessment. Who holds leverage? Who believes they hold leverage? What assumptions are driving behavior? What happens if those assumptions collapse? In my world, the most dangerous moment isn't confrontation. It's overconfidence. And I could feel theirs growing. The honeymoon approached. Flights booked. Bags packed. 10 days in Santorini. White walls. Blue water. Distance from tension. Caroline hugged me tightly the night before we left. "Don't worry about anything here," she said warmly. "We'll keep an eye on the house." Her hand lingered on my arm. I smiled back. "I'm sure you will." At the time, she probably believed that was reassurance. I heard something else entirely, and for the first time since joining that family, I felt something close to certainty. They were about to make a move, and when they did, I would be ready. Preparation doesn't look dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. The week before we left for Santorini, I scheduled what appeared to be ordinary administrative appointments, a mortgage servicing check-in, a routine review call with our attorney, an insurance update confirmation. No one in the family noticed. Why would they? Administrative diligence fits perfectly within the practical Ilara persona. If anything, it reinforced their assumptions about me. But here's what they never realized. I wasn't just maintaining, I was fortifying. First, I verified title security. Not just the current status, but the alert protocols. Any structural change request requires in-person verification with dual consent. I ensured written acknowledgement from the bank that no third-party trustee proposals could be processed without notarized confirmation from both titled owners. Second, I reviewed access permissions, not physical keys. Financial access. No external party had authority to inquire, modify, or represent our mortgage terms. Even inquiries required authentication. Third, I quietly adjusted liquidity positioning. A portion of my personal reserves, already separate by law, was transferred into an account specifically structured for asset protection contingencies. Legal, transparent, smart. Daniel knew I was reviewing things, but he didn't ask for details. He trusted me in financial matters, the way he trusted his father in structural ones. That asymmetry mattered. At dinners, Martin's tone grew lighter. He stopped pressing. Caroline became almost overly affectionate. "We're just so glad you're part of the family," she'd say. And I believed she meant it. But belonging and authority are not the same thing. 3 days before departure, I made one final decision. I installed a smart entry system, not replacing the original locks, but supplementing them. It allowed activity logs, remote access, time-stamped entries, though. I framed it casually. "Security upgrade," I told Daniel. "It's just good practice when traveling." He nodded. "So smart." That word lingered. Smart. They thought I was practical. They didn't know the night before we left, I did something I hadn't done before. I walked through the house alone, slowly. Living room, kitchen, hallway. I placed my hand against the front door and felt its weight. Ownership is a strange concept. Legally precise, emotionally layered. This house wasn't just an asset. It was a boundary, a structure built intentionally. And structures only fall when someone underestimates the foundation. Santorini was beautiful. White stone against blue sky. Quiet mornings on the terrace. Daniel relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in months. Away from his parents, he was lighter, freer. We didn't talk about trusts or titles or frameworks. For 10 days, I allowed myself to be simply a wife. Not a strategist, not a risk assessor, just a woman newly married. And yet, every evening, almost unconsciously, I opened the security app. No alerts, no anomalies, everything quiet. On the 9th day, though, I noticed something. A brief connectivity interruption. It lasted only a few minutes. Probably nothing. But in my world, probably is not a conclusion. It's a placeholder. I didn't panic. I didn't call anyone. I simply noted the timestamp. Daniel never knew. When we boarded the return flight, I felt calm. Not anxious, not suspicious. Prepared. There's a difference. As the plane descended into Seattle, I looked out the window and thought about foundations again. They believed silence meant surrender. They believed distance meant opportunity. They believed the structure could be altered quietly. What they never noticed was that I had documented everything. Patterns, language, timing, and more importantly, I had positioned every lever so that if someone tried to shift my footing, they would trigger something much larger than a door. When the taxi pulled into our driveway that night, I felt a stillness I couldn't quite name. The porch light was on, but something about the front door looked different. I reached into my bag for my key, and that's when the story truly began. I knew before the key turned. There's a sound a familiar lock makes when it recognizes you. A subtle click of alignment. A small mechanical sigh. This one resisted. I tried again, slowly. Nothing. Daniel stepped forward. Maybe it's sticking. He laughed lightly, still in vacation mode. Sun on his skin, salt in his hair. He took the key from my hand and tried with more force. It didn't move. That was the moment the air shifted. I didn't feel panic. I felt confirmation. I stepped back and looked carefully at the handle. It was new. Same finish, same style, different mechanism. Someone had replaced it carefully, intentionally choosing something visually similar. Not an accident. Not wear and tear. Daniel knocked. No answer. He pulled out his phone and called his mother. She answered on the second ring. "Oh, you're back already," she said, voice too bright. "Mum, did you come by the house?" Daniel asked. A pause, half a second. Measured. "Well, yes. We just made a small adjustment. Don't worry. It's for your own good." I watched Daniel's face change. "What adjustment?" "The locks!" Martin's voice entered the call in the background. "Temporary. We thought it would be safer while you were away." Safer. Without telling the homeowners. Daniel looked at me, confusion overtaking relaxation. "You changed our locks?" "It's still the family house," Martin replied evenly. "We just ensure proper oversight." Oversight. That word again. I felt something almost clinical settle inside me. There it was. The move. Not dramatic, not chaotic. Strategic. They hadn't broken a window. They hadn't vandalized anything. They had asserted control. Daniel's voice rose slightly. "You can't just... We can discuss it when you come over," Caroline interrupted gently. "We're only 10 minutes away." I didn't speak during the call. I didn't need to, because in that moment, I understood something with absolute clarity. They believed the house was influenced. They believed access was authority. They believed physical control equaled structural control. They had no idea what actually determined ownership. Daniel hung up, stunned. "This is insane." I placed my hand on his arm. "It's not insane," I said calmly. "It's calculated." He stared at the door again, anger beginning to surface. "We're calling a locksmith." "No," I said. He looked at me, surprised by the firmness in my voice. "Why not?" "Because this isn't about entry. It was about leverage. And I had just realized something they hadn't considered. If they felt confident enough to change locks, they believed they were protected. Which meant they believed something about the structure that wasn't true. While Daniel paced, I opened my phone. Not the security app. My email. There it was. An automated notification timestamped 3 days earlier. Mortgage servicing activity inquiry. Initiated externally. Denied. My lips curved slightly, not in triumph. In clarity. They hadn't just changed the locks. They had tried something else first. And it had failed. Which meant this visible gesture was compensation. A symbolic assertion after a structural rejection. Daniel was still speaking, still upset. "We trusted them." "Yes," I said softly, "we did." I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaken. I wasn't even surprised. Because the moment they presented that trust folder weeks earlier, the trajectory had been predictable. This was an escalation after denial. I finally called the bank. Not to complain, to confirm. The representative was polite and routine. "Yes, Ms. Quinn. There was an inquiry regarding restructuring under a family trust. It was rejected due to the authorization protocol." "Of course," I replied evenly. "And," she continued, "given the attempted modification, the account has now been flagged for heightened protection. No structural changes can occur without in-person verification from you." There it was. Not revenge, not luck. Protocol. When I hung up, I looked at Daniel. "They tried to move the foundation," I said quietly. "The system stopped them." He went pale. "They what?" "And now," I continued calmly, "they've changed the locks because it's the only control they think they have left." There was no celebration in me, only understanding. They thought they had won. They were standing inside a house that legally could not be taken from me, and they didn't even know it. The bank had already called. They just didn't realize what that meant yet. I picked up my suitcase. "Let's go see your parents," I said on Not to argue, to observe, because the real shift wasn't the lock. It was what they had unknowingly triggered. And once certain processes begin, they don't reverse, not even for family. The drive to Daniel's parents' house was quiet. Not tense, not explosive, just recalibrating. Daniel kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other clenched against his thigh. I could see the disbelief working through him in layers, not just at the lock, but at the implication behind it. They wouldn't actually try to take the house, he muttered, almost to himself. They already tried to restructure it, I said gently. The inquiry wasn't theoretical. He exhaled sharply. Maybe it was just curiosity. In banking, I replied calmly, curiosity requires authorization. That silenced him. When we pulled into his parents' driveway, the porch light flicked on almost immediately. They had been watching for us. Caroline opened the door before we reached it. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, stepping toward Daniel first. "You're overreacting. We just wanted to protect what's ours." What's ours? There it was again. The collective possessive that excluded me without saying so directly. Martin stood behind her, posture straight, jaw tight but controlled. He wasn't embarrassed. He was prepared to justify. Daniel spoke first. "You changed our locks." "Yes," Martin said evenly. "Because you're young, and decisions have been made lately without proper consultation." Proper consultation. I met his eyes. "Which decisions?" His gaze shifted to me briefly, then back to his son. "The refusal to consolidate under the trust." Daniel looked confused. "That wasn't your decision to make." "It's family property," Martin insisted. "It needs family governance." Now I understand the exact belief driving this. They assumed emotional authority equaled legal authority. And here was my decision point. I had options. Option 1, escalate publicly, threaten legal action, demand immediate access, humiliate them in their own living room. Option 2, minimize it, accept a spare key, restore harmony superficially, pretend this was a misunderstanding. Option 3, initiate structural consequences quietly and permanently. Not out of anger, out of alignment. I chose the third, but not in that moment. In that living room, I remained composed. "I see," I said softly. "And you attempted to formalize that governance through the bank." Silence. Martin's expression flickered, just slightly. "We were exploring options," he replied carefully. "The bank declined," I continued evenly, "because the structure doesn't permit unilateral modification." Daniel turned toward his father slowly. "You went to the bank?" Caroline stepped in quickly. "It was just precautionary. We were thinking long-term." I watched Daniel's certainty begin to fracture. Not against me, but against them. That was important. I didn't need to attack. The truth was already working. "We want our house back," Daniel said, voice firmer now. Martin hesitated. Then, almost reluctantly, he handed over a new key from the hallway table. Temporary control surrendered. But here's what they didn't understand. The physical key no longer mattered. Because the moment they attempted structural interference without authorization, they triggered compliance review protocols at the bank. And once flagged, accounts don't simply return to normal. They become monitored, audited, protected. As we walked back to the car, Daniel was silent. In that silence, I made the irreversible choice. I would not just restore the status quo. I would restructure ownership clarity in a way that permanently removed external influence. Legally, transparently, decisively. No drama, no shouting, just documentation. Some actions close doors emotionally, others close them structurally. When we arrived home, our home, I didn't immediately unlock the door. I stood on the porch for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle. This wasn't revenge. This was boundary enforcement. And boundaries, once crossed intentionally, don't get reset with apologies. They get reinforced. Inside, the house was untouched. Everything is in place. But something intangible had shifted forever. Daniel looked at me as I set my suitcase down. "What are you thinking?" I met his eyes calmly. "I'm thinking," I said, "that we need to make something very clear, permanently." He didn't ask what that meant, but by the end of the week, everyone would understand, and it wouldn't require another argument. It would require a phone call, one that was already in motion. The morning after we returned, Daniel went to work. I stayed home, not because I was shaken, because timing matters. I made coffee, opened my laptop, placed my black leather notebook beside it. The house was quiet in a way that felt almost observant, like it knew something decisive was about to happen. First, I called our attorney. Not emotionally, not accusatory. "Given the recent unauthorized inquiry," I said calmly, "I'd like to restructure our internal ownership protections." She didn't sound surprised. "In what direction?" "Clarify survivorship. reinforce external interference barriers, and establish unilateral withdrawal contingencies in case of attempted third-party pressure. There was a pause. That's thorough. Yes, I replied softly. It needs to be. Second, I called the bank's risk department, not customer service. Risk. I referenced the flagged inquiry, requested formal documentation of the attempted trust modification submission, asked that it be archived with a notation of non-owner initiation. The representative confirmed everything. Given the nature of the attempt, we've elevated the account's monitoring tier, she explained. No structural or beneficiary changes can occur without dual in-person authentication and legal review. Exactly what I wanted. Then I made the call that shifted everything. I requested a refinance consultation, not because we needed a better rate, because refinancing allows a structural reset. Ownership percentages could be recalibrated based on contribution, liability could be reassessed based on income stability, and crucially, control could be legally clarified. When Daniel came home that evening, I didn't present it as retaliation. I presented it as alignment. They crossed a boundary, I said gently, not emotionally, structurally. He sat at the kitchen island, exhausted. I know. So we reinforced the structure. He looked at me carefully. What does that mean? It means we refinance under updated terms, based on actual contribution, with explicit external exclusion clauses. He frowned slightly. You want to cut them out? No, I corrected calmly. They were never in. I want to make that legally undeniable. That difference mattered. Over the next 2 weeks, everything moved quietly. Appraisals scheduled, income documentation submitted, credit re-evaluated. The results were predictable. My financial profile strengthened the loan term significantly. Lower rate, reduced long-term exposure, increased equity positioning. Daniel saw the numbers. For the first time, he saw the full picture. Not just emotionally, but mathematically. They never understood this, he said quietly. No, I replied. They assume. Assumption is fragile, documentation is not. Meanwhile, his parents returned to normal behavior. Sunday dinners resumed. Caroline avoided the lock topic entirely. Martin acted as though nothing structural had occurred. They believed the incident had been absorbed. What they didn't know was that the refinance application had already entered underwriting. And underwriting, once approved, triggers notifications. Formal ones. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Not to me, to Daniel. The bank's verification department required final confirmation of updated title language and ownership recalibration before funding. Daniel stepped outside to take it. I watched him through the kitchen window as he listened, face gradually shifting from neutral to stunned. When he came back in, he held the phone loosely in his hand. They said, after refinance, the ownership majority shifts. Yes, I said evenly, based on income ratio. Yes, and that any third-party trust proposals require unanimous consent under the new covenant. Yes. He sat down slowly. They'll know. I met his gaze. That's the point. This wasn't punishment. It was a consequence. They had tried to move the foundation without authorization. Now the foundation was being reinforced, publicly, legally, permanently. When the funding cleared the following week, formal letters were issued. Updated deed structure, revised mortgage covenant, heightened interference clause. Martin would receive notification, not because I called him, because the county records would reflect it. No argument, no confrontation, just a fact. The quietest shifts are the most irreversible, and they had no idea what was already unfolding. The bank had called once. Now it would call again. Only this time, it wouldn't be a denial. It would be confirmation. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Not dramatic, not urgent looking. Just a standard county envelope, official seal, neutral typeface, procedural language. Martin signed for it. I know this, because Daniel told me later how his father described the moment. I thought it was just routine, he had said. Then I read the ownership amendment. Ownership amendment. It sounds clinical. It is. By then, the refinance had funded. The new deed structure had been recorded. The mortgage covenant had been updated to reflect contribution-weighted equity and reinforced consent protocols. In simple terms, the house was no longer structurally vulnerable to external maneuvering. Not emotionally, not legally. Daniel received a call that evening. His phone buzzed while we were clearing dinner plates. He looked at the screen, hesitated, then answered. I didn't try to overhear, I didn't need to. His posture shifted almost immediately. What do you mean by majority adjustment? He said, frowning. A pause. No, Dad, that's not a mistake. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear Martin's voice faintly through the speaker, controlled, but sharper than usual. You restructured without consulting us. Daniel inhaled slowly. We restructured our own mortgage. Caroline's voice entered next, quieter, wounded. We were only trying to protect the family. Daniel's eyes met mine across the kitchen. I didn't nod. I didn't signal. I simply held his gaze. The call lasted 9 minutes. When he hung up, he sat down heavily. They're upset, he said. Yes, I replied gently. They think you planned this. I did, I said calmly. He didn't argue, because he now understood the sequence. They had attempted structural modification without authorization. The bank had denied it. They had escalated symbolically by changing the locks. We had responded structurally. The consequences were not emotional. They were systemic. That's what unsettled them most. There was no fight to win, no apology to extract, no dramatic confrontation to dominate. Just a legal reality they could not reverse. Over the next week, subtle shifts appeared. Caroline's texts became cautious. Fewer heart emojis, more measured wording. Martin stopped initiating financial conversations entirely. At Sunday dinner, the atmosphere felt recalibrated. No one mentioned the deed directly, but Martin avoided phrases like family governance. He no longer referenced protecting the line. He asked Daniel neutral questions about work instead. Caroline complimented the house's beautiful upkeep when we mentioned repainting the living room. Upkeep, not oversight. That change in vocabulary mattered. What they were feeling wasn't just frustration, it was displacement. For the first time, they were no longer operating under the assumption of influence. The house, symbolically and legally, had shifted beyond their reach. And they hadn't anticipated that possibility. Consequences don't always look like a loss of money. Sometimes they look like a loss of narrative. They had believed they were guiding two young people. Now they were observers. Daniel noticed it too. They're different, he said quietly one night. Yes, I agreed. Do you feel bad? I considered that carefully. No, I said honestly. I feel unstable. Stability is not cruelty. It's alignment. They had tested structural control. The system responded. And now, without raised voices or public humiliation, the hierarchy had recalibrated. Not through dominance, through documentation. But consequences have stages. Discomfort is first, then the realization. Then the moment when people understand something cannot be undone. We had reached discomfort. Realization was coming. And when it arrived, there would be no lock to change, no folder to present, no authority left to assert, only acceptance or rupture. And that choice would be theirs. Realization arrived on a Friday afternoon. Daniel was at work when his mother called me directly for the first time in weeks. That in itself was unusual. Caroline preferred indirect communication when tension existed. Messages routed through her son, softened through him. Calling me meant something had shifted from irritation to urgency. I answered. Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't cold. It was careful. Elara, she began, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the refinance. I didn't interrupt. We received documentation stating that the ownership distribution has changed. Martin is concerned. Concerned. I leaned back in my chair, letting the words settle. There's no misunderstanding, I said evenly. The adjustment reflects financial contribution and liability ratio. It's standard underwriting. Silence. That wasn't discussed with us, she said quietly. With respect, I replied gently. It wasn't yours to discuss. The pause that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. I think Martin may have misjudged the situation, she admitted finally. We were only trying to protect Daniel. I know. And I meant it. They believed they were safeguarding the legacy. They just misunderstood who held structural authority. Caroline's voice softened further. Is there a way to revisit it? There it was. The request, not to reverse the refinance, because that wasn't possible without substantial financial loss, but to renegotiate influence. In my world, once documents are recorded and covenants executed, reversal isn't simple. It requires penalties, fees, credit impact, and re-underwriting. It's not an emotional reset button. It's math. It's finalized, I said calmly. Any structural change would require full refinancing again, and justification. Another long pause. I don't think Martin realized the implications, she whispered. I pictured him at their kitchen table, papers spread out, reading language he hadn't anticipated. Heightened authorization protocol. Unanimous consent requirement. Contribution weighted equity distribution. Clinical words. Irreversible words. I believe he did, I said gently. He just believed he would control them, Caroline exhaled softly. This has created distance. No, I corrected quietly. The attempt created distance. The refinance clarified it. That distinction mattered. Later that evening, Daniel received another call, this time from his father directly. The conversation was shorter, more direct. You've positioned the house in a way that excludes family, Martin said. Daniel's reply was steady. We positioned it in a way that reflects ownership. That sentence ended the debate. There was no legal misstep, no fraud, no emotional outburst to leverage. Just documentation aligned with the contribution. Too late to fix, too late to undo, too late to pretend it hadn't happened. Over the next few days, something subtle shifted in their tone. Not anger, not hostility, resignation. Martin stopped suggesting future structural plans altogether. Caroline began speaking about your house instead of the family house. Language reveals acceptance. One Sunday, as we prepared to leave their home, Martin walked me to the door. He didn't apologize. He didn't argue. He simply said, "You're more deliberate than I gave you credit for." It wasn't praise. It was an acknowledgement. I prefer clarity, I replied softly. He nodded once. In that nod was something new, not dominance, not warmth. Recognition. The panic phase had passed. The regret had surfaced. But the structure remained. Boundaries, once reinforced through legal action, don't dissolve with discomfort. They stabilize. And stability, once established, becomes the new normal. They had tried to move the foundation. Now they understood. It wasn't movable, and neither was I. The final conversation didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened at their dining table. Same polished wood, same lemon tart, same careful smiles. But the dynamic was different. No folders this time. No frameworks. No subtle vocabulary about governance. Just four adults sitting across from one another, aware that something permanent had shifted. Martin began. I think we need to clear the air. His tone wasn't sharp. It wasn't defensive. It was measured. Daniel glanced at me briefly, then nodded. Okay. Martin folded his hands together. When we suggested consolidating the property under a trust, it wasn't about control. I let him finish. It was about continuity, he continued. I've seen families lose assets because they didn't centralize oversight. Oversight. The word returned, but without the authority it once carried. I understand the concern, I said calmly, but oversight requires jurisdiction. He looked at me carefully. And you believe we didn't have it? I believe ownership determines it. No edge, no sarcasm. Just a fact. Caroline leaned forward slightly. Changing the locks wasn't meant as a power play. What did it meant as? Daniel asked gently. She hesitated. A precaution. For what? He pressed. There was no answer, because there had never been a practical reason, only a symbolic one. Martin exhaled slowly. We felt excluded. The honesty surprised me, not because I hadn't expected it, but because it was finally spoken plainly. You weren't excluded, I said softly. You were limited. He studied that distinction. We're used to being involved, he admitted. I know, I replied. And the refinance, he began, then stopped. It reflected financial structure, I finished for him, not emotion. There was a long silence, not hostile, reflective. This was the confrontation they hadn't anticipated, the one without raised voices, without blame, without humiliation. Just alignment, Martin nodded once. I underestimated you. It wasn't an apology, but it was close. I never asked to be underestimated, I said gently. Daniel reached for my hand under the table, not to steady me, but in solidarity. Caroline's eyes softened. We didn't realize how much authority you held. I didn't advertise it, I replied, because I hadn't needed to. An authority that requires announcement isn't a stable authority. What mattered now wasn't vindication. It was a recalibration. Martin leaned back in his chair. So where do we go from here? The question wasn't strategic anymore. It was relational. We move forward, I said, with clear boundaries. And involvement? Caroline asked cautiously. By invitation, I answered. Not exclusion. Invitation. There's dignity in that difference. The evening ended without drama. No slammed doors, no ultimatums. When we stood to leave, Martin paused near the doorway. I won't interfere again, he said quietly. I met his eyes. I won't need you to. That wasn't defiance. It was a resolution. Outside, the air felt lighter than it had in months. Daniel squeezed my hand. You didn't destroy anything. That was never the goal, I said. Because quiet dominance isn't about winning. It's about ensuring no one confuses silence with surrender again. The confrontation had happened, without heat, without spectacle, without cruelty, and in its calmness, it carried more weight than any argument ever could. The structure was stable. The boundary is clear. The hierarchy reset. Not loudly, permanently. There's a version of this story where I become hardened, where I withdraw from family dinners, where every interaction carries quiet resentment, where I treat victory like armor. But that isn't what happened. What happened was quieter. After the refinance settled and the conversations cooled, something unexpected unfolded. Not in them, in me. For most of my life, I believed strength had to remain invisible to stay effective. That if I displayed too much certainty, it would invite challenge. That if I revealed too much capability, it would threaten fragile dynamics. So I perfected composure, measured responses, strategic silence, calculated patience, and those traits protected me. But somewhere between the lock changing and the bank calling, I realized something important. I wasn't obligated to shrink in order to maintain peace. I could be calm and visible, precise and present, boundaried and kind. The house feels different now. Not because the walls changed, but because the meaning did. When I unlock the front door, it doesn't feel like territory defended. It feels like the structure is understood. Daniel changed too. He began asking me more direct questions about long-term planning. Not deferentially, but collaboratively. He stopped defaulting to his father's framing in financial conversations. He listens differently now. Not because I demanded it, because clarity rearranges perspective. His parents adjusted as well. Caroline now asks before offering suggestions about the house. Martin no longer speaks about governance. When he discusses investments, he makes eye contact with me. That might seem small. It isn't. Recognition doesn't require an apology to matter. It requires recalibration. I don't resent them. Resentment is heavy, and I prefer efficiency. What I feel instead is something steadier. Self-trust confirmed. When the locks changed, I didn't panic. When the trust inquiry surfaced, I didn't explode. When the refinance shifted the majority ownership, I didn't celebrate. I aligned. And alignment is quite powerful. I still carry the black leather notebook. Not because I expect betrayal, but because documentation reminds me that patterns reveal truth long before confrontation does. The difference now is that I don't wait for permission to assert clarity. I don't perform harm. I don't dilute competence to preserve comfort. I speak plainly, gently, without heat. And when boundaries are required, I establish them structurally, not emotionally. The irony is this: they thought changing the locks would secure control. What it actually secured was my refusal to ever be structurally vulnerable again. Not just in property, in identity. I am not the practical daughter-in-law, not the sensible stabilizer, not the quiet addition. I am the architect of my own foundation. And now everyone knows it. Not because I announced it, because the structure reflects it. When people hear this story, they often expect fireworks. They expect screaming in the driveway. They expect a dramatic eviction. They expect revenge dressed as justice. But that's not what this was. This was about structure, about understanding that not all power is loud, not all victories are visible, and not all boundaries need to be defended with raised voices. When my in-laws changed the locks while I was on my honeymoon, they believed they were securing control. When I came back and couldn't enter my own home, they thought they had won. Until the bank called. And that call wasn't dramatic. It wasn't accusatory. It was procedural. It confirmed what I had always known. Ownership isn't defined by proximity or tradition. It's defined by documentation, intention, and alignment. The real lesson wasn't about real estate. It was about underestimation. Sometimes people mistake calm for weakness. They assume that because you don't interrupt, you don't calculate. Because you don't argue, you don't assess. Because you smile, you don't see. But quiet doesn't mean unaware. And silence doesn't mean surrender. If I had exploded in that moment on the porch, I would have confirmed their narrative: emotional, reactive, territorial. Instead, I responded structurally. I didn't humiliate them. I didn't punish them. I reinforced reality. And once reinforced, reality doesn't negotiate. Today, we still have Sunday dinners. We still share holidays. The difference is subtle but permanent. No one discusses governance over something that isn't theirs. No one assumes authority where it doesn't belong. And no one confuses my composure for compliance. If you take anything from this story, let it be this. You don't have to win loudly to win completely. You don't have to shout to be heard, and you don't have to destroy relationships to defend your boundaries. Sometimes the strongest move is the quietest one, the one made in paperwork, in planning, in preparation, long before anyone realizes there's a game being played. So I'm curious, if someone underestimated you and crossed a line, would you confront them emotionally or respond structurally? Tell me in the comments.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.